Think back to the summer you turned 10 years old, or 9, or 12. It doesn't matter exactly. You know the one. The summer when the most important decision of any given morning was which street to take, how far you could push it before you had to turn back for dinner. You know the feeling. 2 wheels beneath you, wind against your face, the neighborhood opening up in every direction. Now think about the bicycle you were riding. Chances are, if you grew up anywhere in the United States between 1950 and 1980, it had a single word on the frame. That word was Schwinn. A word in chrome lettering, pressed into steel, on a machine that weighed more than most bikes today and was built to survive every single thing a child could do to it. Not just a name, a sound. The click of a coaster brake engaging under your heel, the faint metallic hum of a chain running clean over a sprocket. A sprocket that had been assembled by hand by a man in Chicago who did this same motion 1,000 times a day. A bicycle so heavy and so solid that when you dropped it in the driveway, which you always did, it didn't bend. It just lay there, waiting for you to pick it up again. At its peak, the Arnold Schwinn and Company plant on North Costner Avenue in Chicago employed more than 1,800 workers and produced nearly 1 million bicycles a year. At one point in the early 1960s, Schwinn held approximately 25% of the entire American bicycle market. 1 in 4 bikes sold in the United States of America carried that name. The company exported to dozens of countries. Its flagship models, the Phantom, the Stingray, the Varsity, the Paramount, were not merely products. They were cultural landmarks. The Stingray alone sold 3 million units in its first 3 years. They survived the collapse of the American bicycle industry in 1900, when hundreds of competitors vanished overnight. They survived the Great Depression, retooling their production line and finding new markets when half the country couldn't afford a meal. They survived the Second World War, converting part of their factory to military production and returning to civilian bicycle manufacturing the moment the armistice allowed. When the war ended in 1945, Schwinn was positioned unlike almost any other manufacturer. The baby boom that followed was Schwinn's biggest sales opportunity. The Schwinn Stingray was introduced in 1963. It came from the streets of Southern California, where teenage boys had begun modifying their bicycles. Al Fritz, Schwinn's director of product development, watched what the kids were doing and came back to Chicago with a conviction. This wasn't a fad. This was the next bicycle. The Stingray had a small wheel, a long banana seat, and high-rise handlebars. It looked nothing like any bicycle Schwinn had ever made. Some thought it was a mistake. It sold 1 million units in its first year, 3 million in its first 3 years. It became the best-selling bicycle in American history up to that point. Production at Costner was vertically integrated. Schwinn made its own frames, cutting, bending, and welding the steel tubing in-house. They painted them in a dedicated shop. At the top of the Schwinn range sat the Paramount, a hand-built racing bicycle that retailed for more than $300 in the 1960s, at a time when most Schwinn models sold for $40 to $60. The Paramount was made by a team of fewer than 20 specialist frame builders, each of whom could produce no more than a handful of frames per day. It was the bicycle that serious cyclists rode when they wanted the best American machine available. But the brand's true strength was not at the top. It was in the middle. In the Varsity, the Continental, the Stingray, the bikes that millions of American families bought from authorized Schwinn dealers. The dealer network was Schwinn's other great advantage. The company had built a franchise system. By the late 1960s, Schwinn had approximately 1,800 authorized dealers across the United States. You could find one in almost every mid-sized town in the country. This was Schwinn at its zenith, dominant, profitable, and apparently unassailable. And the first cracks were already forming in the foundation. By the early 1970s, something had changed in the American bicycle market. Japanese manufacturers had arrived. Brands like Fuji, Bridgestone, and National Panasonic were entering with 10-speed road bicycles that were lighter and faster than anything in Schwinn's range. The American bicycle boom of 1971 to 1974, triggered by the environmental movement and the oil embargo, brought millions of new buyers into the market. And increasingly, the best bicycle available was not made in Chicago. In 1973, sales climbed to 15 million. Schwinn's production could not keep pace. Dealers were waiting 6 months for orders. Customers who came in asking for a Schwinn left with a Japanese bicycle. Edward R. Schwinn, the grandson of the founder, was running the company during this period. He understood that capacity was the problem. What he could not resolve was how to expand that capacity quickly enough without the capital investment that the company, still privately held, still entirely owned by the Schwinn family, was reluctant to commit. The response that the company settled on in the early 1970s was to source some production from existing Japanese manufacturers. Schwinn contracted with National Panasonic's bicycle division to produce certain mid-range models that would carry the Schwinn name. The logic was straightforward. If you cannot make enough bicycles in Chicago, you have someone else make them and put your label on the result. This was not, in itself, a fatal decision, but it established a pattern, and more importantly, it established a precedent within the company that manufacturing was a variable rather than a constant. That where a bicycle was made was a business decision to be evaluated on cost, not a fundamental commitment to be defended at all costs. The detail that never quite made the headlines at the time was this. Schwinn's senior management, as early as 1974, had begun discussing the possibility of closing the Chicago factory entirely and outsourcing all production to Asia. The workers on the floor of the Costner Avenue plant had no idea this conversation was happening. The union representatives were told that the factory's future was secure. Some of those workers had been there for 20 years because they believed the Schwinn job was permanent. They were wrong, and the people who knew they were wrong said nothing. By 1979, effective control of the company had passed to Edward F. Schwinn, Jr., the great-grandson of Ignaz Schwinn, who had become the company's chief executive. He was in his 30s, educated and convinced that the future of the American bicycle market lay not in Chicago but in Asia. He was not entirely wrong about the market. He was catastrophically wrong about how to respond to it. The key relationship that Edward Schwinn Jr. cultivated, the one that would ultimately destroy the company he had inherited, was with a Taiwanese manufacturer named King Liu. King Liu had founded Giant Manufacturing Company Limited in Taichung, Taiwan in 1972. In its early years, Giant was a small contract manufacturer with limited capabilities and no international profile. Edward Schwinn Jr. saw in Giant exactly what he was looking for. A factory hungry for orders, in a country with labor costs a fraction of Chicago's, with management willing to accept Schwinn's quality standards if Schwinn was willing to teach them what those standards were. What followed was one of the most consequential acts of corporate self-destruction in American industrial history. Schwinn sent its own engineers to Taichung. They went into Giant's factory and taught King Liu's workers how to build bicycles to Schwinn's specifications. They shared manufacturing processes. They transferred quality control knowledge that had taken decades to develop on the floor of the Costner Avenue plant. They essentially gave Giant Manufacturing a complete education in precision bicycle production. In return, Giant agreed to produce bicycles exclusively for Schwinn for a defined period, at prices that made the Chicago operation look increasingly expensive by comparison. By 1981, the arrangement had progressed to the point where Schwinn was sourcing a significant and growing share of its production from Giant and other Taiwanese manufacturers. The Chicago plant still ran, but its workforce had begun to shrink. Workers were told the reductions were temporary. The full picture was not shared. The breaking point came in 1981 when Schwinn's contract with its Japanese supplier, National, expired. Rather than renew it or expand Chicago production, Edward Schwinn Jr. made the decision to redirect that production volume to Taiwan. The company's internal projections, documents that would later surface in litigation, showed that within 3 to 4 years, virtually all Schwinn production would be offshore. In 1982, Edward Schwinn Jr. announced the closure of the North Costner Avenue factory. The date of the announcement was in the spring of that year. Plant manager Don Gillies was informed before the workers. The union was notified formally on the same day the press release was issued. There was no negotiation. There was no transition plan offered to the workforce. There was a notice and a date. One machinist named Robert Kozlowski, who had worked at Costner for 23 years and had, by his own account, never missed a shift, told a local reporter, "I would have bet my house that factory would outlast me. I told my son to put in his application as soon as he turned 18, 23 years, and they tell you it's over in a press release." The plant closed in late 1982. 1,800 workers lost their jobs. Most were over 40. Many had limited formal education beyond what the factory itself had provided. The majority did not find equivalent employment. The factory building on North Costner Avenue did not immediately disappear. For a time it sat empty, enormous and silent, the machinery sold off or scrapped, the union notices still pinned to boards inside the abandoned cafeteria. Chicago did not hold a ceremony. The city was used to factory closures by 1982. It had been happening for 20 years. Schwinn did retain a smaller assembly operation in Greenville, Mississippi, where wages were significantly lower than Chicago. Several hundred workers were employed there. But it was not a manufacturing operation in any meaningful sense. Components arrived from Asia and were assembled by a workforce that had none of the institutional knowledge, none of the generational expertise that the Costner plant had represented. Here is the irony that would eventually become the most studied case study in American business schools. In transferring its manufacturing knowledge to Giant Manufacturing in Taiwan, Schwinn had not merely found a cheaper supplier, it had created its own most dangerous competitor. King Liu, the founder of Giant, was not simply running a contract factory. He was learning. Every specification sheet that Schwinn's engineers handed over, every quality standard that Schwinn insisted upon, every process improvement that Schwinn's people taught, all of it was accumulating inside Giant as institutional knowledge that belonged not to Schwinn, but to Giant. By 1984, approximately 90% of bicycles sold under the Schwinn name were made in Asia. The company had invested in a joint venture in China through a company called the China Bicycles Company, or CBC, based in Shenzhen. Edward Schwinn Jr. believed this would give Schwinn a manufacturing advantage that no other American brand could replicate. A direct stake in Chinese production at the moment China was beginning to open its manufacturing sector to the world. The investment required capital that Schwinn did not easily have. The company took on significant debt. The Greenville, Mississippi assembly plant was still running, but the real action, the real money, was being decided in Taichung and Shenzhen. The dealers felt it before the public did. Since the 1960s, the Schwinn dealer network had been the company's most durable competitive advantage. Authorized dealers sold Schwinn and Schwinn only. They had built their businesses around that exclusivity. They knew Schwinn customers, knew Schwinn products, knew how to speak to parents about why a Schwinn was worth the extra money. Starting in the early 1980s, Schwinn began breaking that deal. Facing pressure from large retailers like Kmart and Sears, they began selling through mass-market channels that directly undercut the dealer's price advantage. If you could buy a Schwinn at Kmart for $50, why would you go to the authorized dealer and pay $70? The dealers left. One by one, then in clusters, the authorized dealer network that Schwinn had spent decades building began to dissolve. Some switched to Trek, some switched to Specialized, some simply closed. By the late 1980s, the dealer network that had numbered 1,800 had shrunk by more than half. Jim Langley, a bicycle journalist who had followed the industry since the 1970s, wrote in Bicycling magazine in 1988, "Schwinn has done something that seemed impossible a decade ago. They have made their own dealers into their enemies." The company never adequately responded to the piece. By 1991, Schwinn was in serious financial difficulty. The debt load was significant. The China Bicycles Company investment had not delivered the returns that had been projected. Giant, the company that Schwinn had trained into existence, was now openly competing with Schwinn in the American market. On the 7th of October, 1992, Arnold Schwinn and Company filed for protection under Chapter 11 of the United States Bankruptcy Code in the Northern District of Illinois. The filing listed liabilities of approximately $75 million. The assets, primarily the brand name and the inventory, were worth considerably less. In December 1992, the bankruptcy court approved a sale process. In 1993, the Zell/Chilmark Fund, a Chicago-based private equity firm run by investor Sam Zell, acquired what remained of Schwinn's assets for approximately $43 million. The Schwinn family received nothing. The Zell/Chilmark acquisition restructured the company as the Schwinn Cycling and Fitness Company. Sam Zell was not a bicycle man. He was an asset manager who believed that the Schwinn name still had consumer recognition valuable enough to build upon. He was right about the recognition. He was less certain about everything else. Through the mid-1990s, Schwinn was rebuilt as essentially a brand management operation, a company that licensed its name to manufacturers in Asia and sold the resulting bicycles through American retailers. There was no factory. There was no assembly line. There were no workers learning a trade. There were product managers and marketing staff and a logo. The Greenville, Mississippi operation had closed entirely. The last workers walked out of the last functioning Schwinn production facility in America on a date in 1991 that did not make the front page of any national newspaper. The industry trades noted it briefly. Most of the mainstream press, by then exhausted by American manufacturing closures, did not cover it at all. What they lost, what left with those workers and never came back, was not merely a factory. It was the accumulated knowledge of 3 generations of people who knew how to build a bicycle that could be ridden hard by a 10-year-old every day for 10 years. And still be standing. That knowledge is not in a patent filing. It is not in a specification sheet. It lived in the hands of workers who are now in their 70s, most of whom never built another bicycle after the day they left. Before we continue, if this kind of deep industrial history matters to you, take a moment right now and subscribe to this channel. We cover stories like this one every week, stories of the companies that built America, the decisions that broke them, and the people who paid the price. Hit the subscribe button and the bell, because this is the kind of content that disappears in the algorithm if you don't tell it you want more. And if this episode is worth your time, the like button costs you nothing and means everything for reaching people who remember these stories firsthand. Now, let us return to the silence that followed the closure. So how does a company with 25% of the American market, with a dealer network in every mid-sized town in the country, with a brand name that 3 generations of American children grew up with, how does it end up insolvent? The answer is not one decision, but it is one family's sustained failure of imagination across 2 decades. Ignaz Schwinn had survived the bicycle bust of 1900 because he was willing to stay when everyone else left. Frank W. Schwinn had revitalized the brand in the 1930s because he was willing to travel, to look at what was happening in other countries, and to bring it home. Edward F. Schwinn Jr., faced with the Japanese and Taiwanese challenge of the 1970s, chose to outsource rather than modernize. He chose short-term cost reduction over long-term competitive defense. And in doing so, he handed the tools of his own destruction to the manufacturers who would use them against him. The deeper answer, the one that was playing out inside those walls, that the management never acknowledged publicly, was that Schwinn had stopped being a manufacturing company and tried to become a brand management company while still pretending to be a manufacturer. It had hollowed itself out and then wondered why it felt empty. And what is there now on North Costner Avenue in Chicago? The Schwinn factory site, the plant that once employed 1,800 people, is occupied today by a mix of smaller commercial and light industrial tenants. The enormous buildings were eventually modified or demolished. There is no plaque. There is no monument. A person driving down Costner today, not knowing what had stood there, would see nothing that would suggest any significance. The Chicago History Museum holds some Schwinn materials in its collection: photographs, a few original bicycles, some corporate documents. Collectors across the country maintain original Phantoms, original Stingrays, original Paramounts. At auction, a restored Schwinn Phantom from the early 1950s regularly sells for more than $1,000. The market for what Schwinn once made is, in a painful irony, stronger than the market that destroyed the company. The Schwinn name itself survived, in a diminished form that Ignaz Schwinn would not have recognized. After the Zell/Chilmark era, the brand passed to Scott Sports Group and then to Pacific Cycle. Today, bicycles carrying the Schwinn name are manufactured in Asia and sold primarily through large retail chains. They are inexpensive. They are adequate. They are not what a worker in Chicago spent a career learning to build. Giant Manufacturing Company, the Taiwanese firm that Schwinn's engineers trained in the early 1980s, is today one of the 2 largest bicycle manufacturers in the world. In 2022, Giant Group reported revenues of more than the equivalent of $2 billion. The company that Schwinn created outlasted, outgrew, and outcompeted the company that created it. This is what Schwinn's collapse actually was: a company that chose to give away its competitive advantage piece by piece, decision by decision, year by year, and then could not understand why the advantage was gone. The blame does not rest entirely with Edward F. Schwinn Jr., though his decisions were the critical ones. The federal government's trade policy made it easier to import finished Asian bicycles than to protect the domestic base. The union could not prevent what management concealed. And the consumers, who bought the cheaper bicycle, were making rational decisions within a system arranged to make those decisions inevitable. Someone had to decide, specifically and deliberately, to send engineers to Taiwan. Someone had to sign the closure notice for Kostner Avenue. Those decisions had names attached to them, and they had consequences attached to them too. Consequences that were paid by Robert Kozlowski, who worked 23 years on a factory floor and was told it was over in a press release. By Thomas Earl Whitfield, who heard about the bankruptcy on the radio. By the hundreds of workers in Greenville and Chicago whose pension contributions outlasted the company they worked for. If you grew up riding a Schwinn, if your parents bought one for you in 1968 or 1972 or 1979 and you remember what it felt like to ride something that seemed built to last forever, then you already know what was lost, and you already know it didn't have to happen. If this story moved you, if you believe these histories deserve to be told carefully and completely, please consider subscribing right now. We release new documentaries every week. Do not miss them. If your father worked at Kostner Avenue, if you delivered Schwinns on a paper route in 1971, tell us what you remember in the comments below. These stories belong to the people who lived them, and they deserve to be heard.